Abusive husband lashes out at his wife for not paying the bills. But his son's bold warning to him changed everything. Mark's presence in the household was like a dark shadow that stretched across every room. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, an uneasy quiet would settle in the home, a silence pregnant with the weight of unspoken tension. Sarah, Mark's wife, moved silently through her day, her every gesture measured, careful, and filled with an undercurrent of dread. The air was thick with the unspoken memory of past outbursts, and though the world outside bustled with life, inside the walls of their home, a storm was always brewing. Mark had always believed that his authority came from fear. His strong, often cold gaze left little room for dissent. The very air in the house seemed to bend to his will, and his words, sharp and filled with malice, cut deeper than any knife. Even in moments of calm, Sarah could feel the tremor of anger that lay just beneath the surface. Her every step was cautious, as if she were tiptoeing around a minefield of Mark's unpredictable moods. Despite the oppressive atmosphere, there was a spark of resilience in Sarah. In the quiet moments before dawn, when the weight of the night still clung to her, she would reminisce about a time when love had graced their union, a time when laughter filled the halls instead of hushed sobs. But those memories were now distant echoes, drowned out by the relentless barrage of Mark's temper. In stark contrast to his mother's subdued sorrow was their son, Jake, who at 20 years old, had already endured more than most in a lifetime. Though young, he carried an air of quiet determination. He had watched his father's fury with growing horror, each violent outburst chiseling away at his own sense of security. Jake's heart had hardened in the crucible of domestic strife, yet beneath that hardened exterior was a soul yearning for justice and peace. That first chapter of their lives was marked by a ceaseless inner battle, a conflict between hope and despair. Sarah's gentle spirit struggled to break free from the chains of her fear, while Jake's silent rage simmered, waiting for the moment to burst forth like a tempest. Mark, oblivious to the collateral damage he wrought with every lash of his tongue, continued to enforce his dominion over the family. The house itself bore the scars of these turbulent years, creaking floors that whispered secrets of late-night quarrels, and walls that had witnessed more tears than they could ever hold. Outside, neighbors exchanged wary glances, aware of the storm that raged within, but powerless to intervene. And so, the stage was set for a dramatic unfolding. A quiet rebellion was slowly taking shape, waiting for the precise moment to shatter the long-held silence. In the fragile equilibrium of their daily existence, every heartbeat pulsed with the promise of change, however uncertain its arrival. The early hours of a bitter winter morning revealed more than just the chill of the season. They exposed the raw edges of a home steeped in fear and anger. Mark's footsteps thundered down the hall as he roused from restless sleep, his eyes burning with an intensity that sent shivers down the spines of those around him. Each step was a reminder that the calm before the storm was nothing more than a deceptive lull. Inside the modest kitchen, Sarah prepared a meager breakfast with trembling hands, her mind occupied by an ever-present anxiety. The clinking of dishes, once a sign of domestic normalcy, now resonated as a grim prelude to the inevitable confrontation. She moved with practiced care, each gesture laden with a silent plea for the day to pass without incident. Yet, as the morning wore on, the calm was shattered by the unmistakable sound of Mark's booming voice. In a burst of anger that seemed to awaken the very walls, Mark's tirade filled the space with venom. His accusations came like shards of broken glass, slicing through the remnants of peace that Sarah clung to. "Why can't you get anything right?" he bellowed, his voice echoing with unbridled fury. The words, soaked in contempt and resentment, filled the room with a palpable tension that made even the air feel heavy. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she attempted to explain, her voice barely a whisper against the cacophony of his wrath. Every word was met with disdain, every excuse with a fresh surge of anger. The cycle was relentless, a grim dance of abuse that had taken root in their lives over countless days and nights. Amidst this chaos, Jake watched from a corner of the room, his heart pounding with an emotion too complex to name, a mixture of fear, anger, and a desperate need to protect the one person who had suffered most in silence. Jake's mind raced as he witnessed the pain etched into his mother's face. He could no longer stand by and watch the woman he adored crumble under the weight of his father's fury. Each accusation, each lash of verbal cruelty, was a step toward a breaking point that loomed ever closer. The domestic landscape was shifting. The violent outbursts were no longer isolated events, but part of a destructive continuum that threatened to consume everything in its path. That day, as Mark's voice receded into the distance and an uneasy silence returned, a spark was ignited in Jake's heart. The echoes of his father's anger reverberated within him, fueling a determination to stand against the tyranny that had defined their existence for far too long. In that moment of introspection, Jake made a silent vow. He would not allow the cycle of abuse to continue unchecked. His inner resolve grew stronger with each passing minute, a resolve that would soon demand action and force the long-suppressed truth into the harsh light of day. As the shadows of the past mingled with the uncertainty of the future, the stage was set for a confrontation that promised to alter the course of their lives forever. The silent rebellion had begun, and its first steps were as inevitable as the dawn. The days that followed the harsh confrontation in the kitchen carried an unbearable tension. In the quiet aftermath of a brutal morning, Sarah found herself trembling in the stillness of the house. Every sound, a creak of the floorboard, a sigh of the wind through the broken window, echoed the dread of what might come next. The oppressive silence, as heavy as the memories that haunted every corner, seemed to press down on her. The fear and sorrow that had accumulated over years of abuse were now on the verge of an explosion. Jake, though still reeling from his inner storm of emotions, began to understand that something in their lives had irrevocably changed. The familiar pattern of abuse was no longer an accepted, if painful, part of their daily existence. Every angry word and every raised hand had led them here, to this moment of palpable inevitability. In his own private space, Jake wrestled with a mix of terror and determination, feeling that the time for passive suffering was over. The weight of responsibility pressed on his young shoulders, and he realized that any further silence would mean the continuation of his mother's agony and his own torment. That afternoon, as heavy clouds gathered outside, the tension within the household reached a critical juncture. Mark's voice, usually so commanding and destructive, now carried an unpredictable edge. Every syllable was fraught with an undercurrent of danger, and the very air vibrated with his barely restrained anger. Sarah, with tear-stained cheeks and trembling hands, could only whisper feeble pleas in a desperate bid to restore even a fleeting moment of calm. The confrontation was no longer a singular event, but a cumulative force that had pushed every heart to its breaking point. In a moment of stark clarity, Jake felt the rising tide of his own resolve. With every ounce of strength, he stepped forward, his eyes blazing with a mixture of fear and defiance. His inner voice thundered, "I won't let this continue." His presence was a silent promise that the cycle of pain would be challenged. The simmering anger in him now morphed into an unwavering commitment to protect the one person he loved above all else. In that charged moment, every passing second seemed to stand still as the future teetered on the brink of irreversible change. As the sky darkened with the promise of rain, the household became a crucible of emotions: anger, sorrow, and a faint yet defiant hope. The breaking point was here, and with it came the unspoken realization that life could no longer remain trapped in a cycle of abuse. A decision was about to be made that would send shockwaves through the fragile structure of their family. The stage was set for a confrontation that would alter their lives forever. And as the first drops of rain began to fall, the journey toward a new beginning had quietly begun. In the wake of that fateful morning, tension coiled around every member of the household like a living thing. The air was thick with an urgency that defied the usual heaviness of unspoken fears. Mark's temper, which had long been a weapon to enforce his will, now burned with a fiercer intensity. Yet, in the midst of the escalating storm, Jake's inner resolve had crystallized into a stark and courageous declaration. He knew that silence would only enable the cycle of cruelty to continue, and that day, his voice would be the spark that could shatter the darkness. During a dinner that was meant to be a fleeting attempt at normalcy, Mark's irritation boiled over. A misplaced word or an unintentional gesture from Sarah ignited a fury in him that could not be contained. His face contorted into a mask of rage as he hurled accusations at Sarah, each word laced with venom and spite. The dining room, which should have been a sanctuary of nourishment and familial warmth, became the stage for another of Mark's explosive outbursts. The clatter of cutlery and the rising cadence of his shouts drowned out any attempts at calm conversation. As the verbal onslaught reached its crescendo, Jake's eyes hardened with resolve. In the midst of chaos, his voice rang out, a declaration that cut through the din like a clarion call for justice. "If you ever lay a hand on Mom again, I'll fight back," he warned, his tone unwavering and fierce. The words hung in the air, charged with the weight of his conviction. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Mark's wild eyes, normally so confident in their intimidation, flickered with disbelief. His momentum faltered under the unexpected defiance of his own son. The room fell into a stunned silence, every heartbeat a resounding echo of that bold declaration. Sarah, caught between hope and terror, felt a complex mixture of relief and sorrow. The unyielding courage in Jake's voice gave her a glimpse of a future free from constant fear, a future where someone stood up to the relentless tyranny. Yet the risk of defiance was high. It threatened to upend the fragile, dangerous equilibrium that had long dictated their lives. In that charged moment, Mark's reaction was swift and merciless. The shock of Jake's words was eclipsed by his own deep-seated rage. His fury erupted once more, louder and more brutal than before, as if the insult had awakened a part of him that cared not for the consequences. In the ensuing chaos, the family's fate teetered precariously on the edge. Every word exchanged, every threat made, felt like a step further into an uncertain and perilous future. That night, as darkness swallowed the remnants of the day, the warning that Jake had uttered took on an almost prophetic significance. The declaration of defiance was not merely a challenge to Mark's authority. It was the first unmistakable sign that the cycle of abuse was under threat of being broken. In the quiet corners of the house and the whispered hopes of Sarah's heart, the seeds of change were being sown. And though the path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty and danger, the promise of a future where fear no longer reigned was a beacon of light in the oppressive gloom. The fallout from Jake's bold declaration was swift and devastating. In the immediate aftermath of that charged confrontation, Mark's fury took on a new, unyielding form. His pride was wounded beyond repair, and the challenge from his own son shattered the carefully constructed illusion of control he had maintained for so long. In a blur of raw anger, Mark declared that neither Sarah nor Jake was welcome under his roof any longer. The words were as cold as they were final, a disowning that cut deep into the very fabric of their family. That evening, as a bitter wind swept through the streets, Mark's decision was carried out with ruthless efficiency. With little more than a few hastily packed belongings, Sarah and Jake were forced to leave the only home they had ever known. The door closed behind them with a resounding finality that echoed in their hearts. They found themselves wandering the familiar neighborhood as strangers in a place that had once been filled with memories, now tainted by betrayal and fear. Sarah's sorrow was immeasurable. The home, once a shelter from the storms of life, had transformed into a prison of her own making, a constant reminder of her worthlessness in Mark's eyes. Every step away from the house was a painful act of liberation, yet it was also a step into the unknown. Jake, too, was left reeling. The heavy responsibility of protecting his mother now lay squarely on his shoulders, and the abrupt severance from his father created a void filled with both terror and the glimmer of hope for change. Neighbors who had silently witnessed the domestic strife now exchanged knowing glances, their shared disdain for Mark's tyrannical behavior evident. Whispers and murmurs spread through the community like wildfire, as the truth of the family's ordeal became an open secret. Though the isolation of abuse had once kept them hidden in the shadows, Now the public nature of their suffering brought with it a mix of sympathy and indignation. Many wondered if this dramatic act of disownment would finally mark the end of Mark's reign of terror. In the days that followed, Sarah and Jake found themselves grappling with an avalanche of emotions. The initial shock of expulsion slowly gave way to a resolute determination to reclaim their lives. They took shelter in the modest home of a distant relative, a safe haven that, while unfamiliar, offered the promise of a fresh start. Each day became a battle against the despair that threatened to engulf them, yet they clung to the belief that life beyond the oppressive walls of their former home was possible. Amid the uncertainty, the disowning served as a pivotal moment of transformation. It was both an ending and a beginning, a painful severance from a past marred by violence and control, and the first tentative steps toward a future defined by autonomy and healing. As Sarah and Jake navigated this treacherous terrain, they learned that sometimes the most difficult decisions were the ones that held the potential to liberate the soul. In the shadow of their loss, the promise of recovery began to take root, signaling that even in the darkest moments, the possibility of renewal remained. In the wake of the forced departure from their home, the fallout reverberated through the community like an echo of long-suppressed truths. The once silent neighbors, now emboldened by witnessing the public unraveling of a tyranny, decided that it was time to act. Whispers in hallways and furtive glances exchanged across picket fences turned into determined phone calls and ultimately reports to the authorities. The delicate balance of silence that had long shielded Mark's abusive reign was finally shattered by a chorus of voices demanding accountability. The police arrived on a dreary afternoon, their presence sending ripples of uncertainty through the neighborhood. For many, this was the first tangible acknowledgement that the suffering of Sarah and Jake was not something to be hidden away or tolerated. As officers began gathering evidence and taking statements from neighbors who had long grown weary of Mark's brutality, the truth of his actions emerged in stark detail. Every whispered account, every tearful recollection of pain, painted a damning portrait of a man who had used fear as his weapon and silence as his accomplice. Back at the temporary refuge of Sarah and Jake's new shelter, the mood was a complicated mixture of relief and trepidation. The intervention of law enforcement promised justice and the chance for their voices to be heard, yet it also threatened to reopen old wounds. For Sarah, each conversation with a police officer was a reminder of every moment she had spent cowering in the shadows of her own home. For Jake, the process was both vindicating and sorrowful, a public acknowledgement of the years he had spent silently enduring his father's tyranny. As the investigation unfolded, the community found itself caught in a moral reckoning. Neighbors, who had once turned a blind eye to the signs of abuse, now wrestled with their own complicity. The courage of a few had broken the cycle, but it also cast a harsh light on years of inaction. In community meetings and hushed conversations, the question arose: how many voices had remained silent while one family suffered behind closed doors? While the police pursued the case with a determination born of collective outrage, Sarah and Jake began to piece together their shattered lives. The process of reclaiming one's identity after trauma is neither swift nor linear, and every day presented new challenges. The very idea of trust, once so fragile in their family, had to be rebuilt from scratch. Yet in every small act of kindness, in every supportive word from a concerned neighbor, they found a spark of hope. For Jake, the knowledge that his warning had been the catalyst for change was bittersweet. The resolve that had driven him to speak up was now tempered by the realization that the road ahead would be fraught with both external battles and internal healing. In the weeks that followed, as court dates were set and the legal machinery began to churn, the two slowly started to envision a future where their lives might finally be defined not by fear, but by resilience and hope. The aftermath of the confrontation, with its mix of pain, justice, and communal reckoning, marked a turning point in their narrative. The story of abuse, anger, and defiance had spilled into the public domain, and the process of accountability had begun. Even as the shadows of the past clung to them, Sarah and Jake took their first tentative steps toward a life where they were no longer defined by the violence they had endured, but rather by the strength it had awakened within them. As dusk fell on a chilly autumn evening, Mark's world began to crumble in ways he had never anticipated. The arrest that had been brewing in the background for so long finally came to a head. On that fateful night, the police arrived at his home with a resolve that brooked no argument. The pounding on the door resonated like the final toll of a bell, signaling the inevitable end of his reign of terror. Mark's heart raced as he fumbled for words, but his usual bravado was stripped away by the cold reality of the law. The scene that unfolded was both chaotic and surreal. Mark, once so used to commanding fear, was now the one trapped in the unforgiving grip of authority. Officers swiftly moved through the space that had borne witness to countless acts of cruelty. Every room, every dark corner that had hidden secrets of pain, was now under scrutiny. The evidence of his abuse was undeniable, and the testimonies of frightened neighbors added weight to the case. As he was led away in handcuffs, Mark's eyes darted around, searching for any vestige of the power he had once wielded. But the control he had taken for granted was gone, replaced by a stark, inescapable reality. Outside, the chilly night air carried whispers of vindication from the community. The very people who had once endured the echoes of his abuse now looked on with a mix of relief and sorrow. The arrest was not just a legal maneuver. It was the culmination of years of pent-up anger and suppressed courage. For Sarah and Jake, the moment was a bitter mixture of justice and heartache. The father they had known, the man whose actions had cast long shadows over their lives, was now being held accountable for his misdeeds. Yet the loss was palpable, a void that was filled with both relief and an overwhelming sense of uncertainty about the future. During the short drive to the police station, silence reigned inside the vehicle, a silence heavy with the realization that everything had changed. Mark's face, normally a mask of impenetrable fury, now bore the marks of shock and regret. The journey was a dark mirror reflecting back the consequences of his actions. Each mile traveled was a step further away from a life he had once known, a life defined by dominance, cruelty, and the illusion of control. In the sterile confines of the holding cell, time seemed to slow to a crawl. Mark sat alone, the reality of his situation sinking in with each passing minute. The once invincible figure was now reduced to a solitary man, surrounded by cold concrete and the relentless tick of a clock. Every minute in that cell was a harsh reminder of the irreparable damage he had inflicted on those he was supposed to love. The silence in the cell was oppressive, and in that solitude, Mark was forced to confront the truth. His actions had irrevocably altered the course of his life. The arrest, with all its legal consequences and personal reckonings, marked a turning point. It was a moment that encapsulated the downfall of a man who had once believed that fear was his greatest weapon. In the dark solitude of that holding cell, regret began to gnaw at him. A slow, painful realization that the man he had been was long gone, replaced by a reflection of cruelty and lost opportunities. The path ahead was uncertain, but as the night deepened, even Mark had to wonder if this was the beginning of an end, and perhaps, in time, the first step toward redemption. Inside the frigid confines of his cell, Mark was left alone with the relentless tick of a clock and a mounting tide of regret. The sterile environment, void of any warmth or human connection, magnified the isolation he had long imposed on his family. Here, in the stark reality of confinement, every sound, the clanging of metal doors, the distant murmur of other inmates, served as a painful reminder of his past actions and the irreversible damage he had wrought. Each passing hour was a relentless confrontation with his own conscience. In the solitude of that cold cell, memories played out with brutal clarity. The terrified eyes of Sarah as she cowered, the steely determination in Jake's gaze when he declared his protection, and the countless moments of abuse that had defined his rule at home. The echoes of his violent outbursts reverberated in his mind, each recollection cutting deeper than the last. It was in this suffocating solitude that the true weight of his actions began to sink in, a heavy realization that no amount of anger or pride could ever justify the pain he had inflicted. As the days blurred into a monotonous cycle of despair and introspection, Mark found himself grappling with a tumult of emotions. Anger had once been his shield and sword, but now it had become the source of his torment. With nothing but his own thoughts for company, he began to confront the stark truth. The cycle of violence he had nurtured had not only destroyed the trust of those he loved, but had also left him utterly alone. The jail cell, cold and unyielding, forced him to face the consequences of a lifetime spent in denial and cruelty. In those long hours, the man who had once wielded fear as a weapon now found himself at the mercy of regret. Every minute spent in isolation was a lesson in humility, a painful reminder that redemption, if it were even possible, would require a level of accountability he had never before dared to acknowledge. Outside the cell, the world moved on, but inside, time was a slow and merciless tutor, teaching him that the price of abuse was measured not in punishment alone, but in the irreversible loss of trust and love. With each new day, Mark's reflections grew more profound. The silence of his surroundings became a canvas upon which he painted his regrets, each thought a reminder of opportunities squandered and bridges burned. The isolation forced him to confront the possibility that change was not only necessary, but the only path to salvaging the remnants of a life that he had once taken for granted. In the bleak confines of that cell, a seed of remorse began to sprout, a seed that, if nurtured, might one day lead to genuine transformation. Yet the road to redemption was long and fraught with uncertainty, and every tick of the clock served as both a punishment and a promise that the man he had once been was gone, replaced by someone who now faced his past with unflinching honesty. After serving his short sentence, Mark stepped out into the world with a heart heavy with remorse and eyes that now carried the weight of regret. The first rays of dawn found him on the doorstep of the home he had once ruled with an iron fist, a home that now felt like a distant memory of pain and isolation. Every step he took was tentative, as if each movement might shatter the fragile hope of forgiveness he clung to. The scars of abuse, both visible and invisible, were now undeniable, and Mark understood that the path to redemption would be steep and fraught with uncertainty. Summoning every ounce of courage, he reached out to Sarah and Jake. The meeting was arranged in a modest park away from the painful memories of their former home, a neutral ground where the possibility of reconciliation could begin to take root. Sarah stood at a distance, her eyes wary and filled with guarded sorrow. Beside her, Jake's stance was protective yet conflicted, a mixture of resentment for past pain and a fragile hope that perhaps change was possible. In that charged moment, Mark's voice trembled with sincerity as he uttered words that had long been buried under layers of pride and denial. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice raw with emotion and regret. There was no grand explanation, no elaborate justification, only the unvarnished truth of a man who had lost everything that truly mattered. As tears welled in his eyes, Mark recounted the long, lonely hours spent in that cold cell, describing how every minute had forced him to confront the harsh reality of his actions. The apology was not merely a request for forgiveness. It was an acknowledgement of a lifetime of cruelty and the painful cost of his temper. Sarah listened in silence, the hurt etched on her face softening, if only slightly, as she witnessed the vulnerability of a man who had never before allowed himself to be so exposed. Jake's expression was unreadable, a storm of emotions swirling behind eyes that had seen too much pain. In that quiet space, the air was thick with both sorrow and the tentative promise of change. The conversation meandered through memories of the past, where the echoes of abuse intermingled with fleeting moments of love that had once defined their family. Mark's apology, though raw and imperfect, was a crack in the wall of anger that had kept them apart. For Sarah, it was the beginning of a long, uncertain journey towards healing, a journey that would require more than words, but consistent actions over time. And for Jake, the encounter was both a validation of his long-held pain and a challenge to believe that even the most broken bonds could be mended, if only slowly and with immense effort. As the meeting drew to a close and the park's fading light gave way to the approaching night, a fragile truce had been established. Mark's apology did not erase the past, nor did it guarantee immediate forgiveness, but it set in motion a series of events that promised change. In that moment, as the family parted ways with hearts heavy yet cautiously hopeful, the promise of a new beginning glimmered in the distance, a promise that redemption was possible, even in the aftermath of unspeakable pain. In the weeks that followed, the tentative olive branch extended by Mark slowly began to transform into a fragile ray of hope. The city's early winter chill mirrored the cautious distance that still existed between the family members. Yet beneath that frosty exterior, something tender and almost imperceptible was stirring, a mutual desire to reclaim the lost fragments of their lives. Mark, determined to prove that his remorse was genuine, sought every opportunity to demonstrate change. His days were now spent in quiet acts of service, volunteering at local shelters, attending anger management sessions, and writing heartfelt letters of apology to those he had wronged. For Sarah, each day was a quiet battle against the memories that had once defined her existence. The pain of the past was like a persistent shadow, but amidst the cold winter mornings, she found small moments of solace. In the gentle smile of a neighbor, the soft murmur of a supportive friend, or the simple act of preparing a warm meal, Sarah began to sense that life might still hold moments of grace. It was in these everyday acts that hope began to take root, offering a glimpse of a future free from the omnipresent fear that had once consumed her. Jake, now stepping into the role of both protector and reluctant mediator, worked tirelessly to bridge the gap between past grievances and the possibility of reconciliation. Every conversation with his father was measured and deliberate, a cautious exploration of uncharted emotional territory. He insisted on transparency and consistency, qualities that he had long deemed absent in the man who had caused so much pain. Yet even as he guarded his heart, Jake found himself yearning for a day when his family could finally heal together. The road ahead was uncertain, but the promise of transformation fueled his determination. Together, the three began to chart a new course, one filled with difficult conversations and tentative moments of trust. They met regularly in neutral spaces, a quiet cafe, a community center, where the absence of past triggers allowed them to interact without the oppressive weight of old wounds. In these meetings, the tone was both subdued and hopeful, each word a tentative step toward rebuilding what had once been irreparably broken. The atmosphere was charged with the kind of raw honesty that could only come from confronting deep-seated pain head-on. Outside, as the first signs of spring stirred beneath the winter's chill, the family found that even the smallest signs of renewal were cause for celebration. A blooming flower in a neglected garden, a bird's song at dawn, or a simple smile shared over tea, each was a small miracle, a sign that life, despite its scars, was moving forward. And though the past was never far behind, it was now counterbalanced by a shared commitment to create a future built on empathy, understanding, and forgiveness. That delicate balance, fragile yet promising, was a ray of hope that illuminated even the darkest corners of their past. It was a reminder that every journey toward healing is paved with small, seemingly insignificant steps. Steps that, when taken together, can lead to profound transformation. And in those quiet, resolute moments, the promise of tomorrow began to outshine the lingering shadows of yesterday. As the season shifted and the chill of winter gave way to the soft promise of spring, Sarah and Jake embarked on a slow and arduous journey toward recovery. The wounds inflicted by years of abuse could not be healed overnight, but each day brought small victories, a moment of laughter, a shared understanding, a step taken in the direction of healing. The road was long and uneven, marked by setbacks and tentative triumphs alike. For Sarah, recovery was a personal odyssey. Each morning she rose with a determination to reclaim her identity, no longer defined solely by the scars of the past. She began attending counseling sessions where gentle, empathetic voices helped her untangle the intricate web of fear and sorrow. In those sessions, she learned that healing was not a linear process, but a tapestry woven from moments of vulnerability and strength. Gradually, the heavy burden of self-doubt and guilt began to lift, replaced by a cautious optimism that whispered of brighter days. Jake, too, found himself navigating the complexities of recovery. The anger and pain that had once burned so fiercely were now being tempered by a burgeoning desire to build a better future. He took on new responsibilities, finding a part-time job, enrolling in courses that promised to expand his horizons, and in doing so, began to forge an identity beyond the role of a beleaguered son and protector. In his quiet determination, there was an underlying hope that he could mend the fractures of the past and create a life defined by resilience rather than regret. Together, Sarah and Jake forged a fragile but unbreakable bond. Their shared experiences, though marred by trauma, became the foundation upon which they built their recovery. They spent long evenings walking through the park, their conversations meandering from painful memories to dreams of a future free from the shadows of abuse. In these walks, each step was symbolic, a step away from the oppressive legacy of their former life and toward the promise of renewal. Throughout this journey, the scars of the past never fully disappeared. They remained etched in quiet corners of memory. Yet with each passing day, those scars began to fade, replaced by the soft light of understanding and forgiveness. The process was neither quick nor easy, but every tear shed, every moment of shared vulnerability, was a stepping stone on the path to healing. The road to recovery was marked by a slow but steady transformation, one that required unwavering courage, endless patience, and a deep, abiding commitment to moving forward. In the midst of this transformation, the family began to see that the true measure of recovery was not in the absence of pain, but in the strength to rise above it. The journey was far from over, and the past would always be a part of them, but the promise of a better future shone brightly on the horizon. With every day that passed, Sarah and Jake learned that healing was possible, and that sometimes the most difficult journeys lead to the most profound transformations. Rebuilding trust after a lifetime of fear and betrayal was akin to piecing together a shattered mirror, each fragment reflective of both sorrow and the possibility of renewal. In the wake of Mark's heartfelt apology and the initial steps toward change, the family found themselves at the beginning of a new, uncertain chapter. Trust, once eroded by years of manipulation and abuse, had to be re-earned through consistent actions, open dialogue, and the courage to be vulnerable once more. Mark, fully aware of the enormity of his misdeeds, committed himself to a strict regimen of self-improvement. Daily, he attended therapy sessions, where he was forced to confront the deeply ingrained patterns that had dictated his behavior for so long. Each session was an exercise in humility, a relentless process of dissecting the anger that had ruled his life and striving to replace it with genuine remorse and understanding. His journey was fraught with setbacks, but the steady rhythm of his efforts slowly began to speak louder than the echoes of his past transgressions. Sarah, still scarred but not broken, found the path to forgiveness to be steep and littered with doubt. Yet with the passage of time, she witnessed small but significant changes in the man who had once been her tormentor. Simple gestures, a shared meal without tension, a moment of sincere conversation, or the subtle shift in his tone when addressing the past, began to rebuild the crumbling foundations of trust. These moments, though fragile, offered glimpses of the possibility that a life defined by fear could be replaced by one of empathy and accountability. For Jake, the process was the most challenging of all. Having long borne the weight of his father's cruelty, he was naturally reluctant to open his heart to the idea of forgiveness. Every interaction was scrutinized, and every word weighed against the painful memories of abuse. Yet in time, Jake discovered that trust could be a slow, deliberate process, a series of small, consistent actions that, together, paved the way for healing. He began to see that while the past could never be forgotten, it did not have to dictate the future. The rebuilding of trust was a shared responsibility, and as he observed his father's sincere efforts, a cautious hope began to blossom. Family meetings became a cornerstone of this gradual transformation. In a safe, neutral environment, Mark, Sarah, and Jake sat together to discuss not only their shared history, but also their hopes for the future. These sessions, sometimes filled with raw emotion and difficult truths, slowly began to stitch together the frayed edges of their relationship. Each conversation was a step forward, a tangible reminder that while the wounds might never fully disappear, they could eventually heal. Over time, the daily grind of rebuilding trust became less about reliving the pain of the past and more about creating a new narrative. The family learned that forgiveness was not an immediate release from suffering, but rather a steady progression towards a life marked by mutual respect, accountability, and understanding. As the fragments of broken trust were painstakingly pieced together, a new, more resilient bond began to emerge, a bond that, while scarred by history, promised the strength to endure the challenges of tomorrow. Spring arrived with a burst of color and hope, ushering in a season of renewal that touched every facet of the family's life. With the foundation of trust slowly being rebuilt, Sarah, Jake, and Mark embarked on a journey toward new beginnings. The painful chapters of the past, though ever present in memory, were gradually overshadowed by the promise of a future defined not by old wounds, but by the courage to move forward. For Sarah, new beginnings were born in moments of quiet defiance. Every morning, as she prepared a simple breakfast in her modest kitchen at her relative's home, she felt the stirring of hope that she could one day reclaim her life. She enrolled in creative workshops and community groups, where she discovered that her voice, once stifled by fear, could be a source of strength and inspiration. The friendships she forged were built on mutual respect and shared experiences, offering her a safe space to rebuild her identity. Jake, too, began to carve out a future that was distinctly his own. Determined to break free from the shadows of his past, he pursued further education and found a job that not only provided financial independence, but also instilled a sense of purpose. Every day was a reminder that his future was not chained to the trauma of yesterday, but was instead an open canvas waiting to be painted with his dreams. His interactions with colleagues and friends were imbued with a newfound confidence, a subtle yet defiant declaration that he would no longer be defined by his history. Mark's journey, though met with skepticism and cautious optimism, was marked by steady progress. The man, who had once been consumed by rage, now dedicated himself to community service and self-reflection. He found solace in small acts of kindness, a smile to a neighbor, a helping hand to a stranger, and slowly began to dismantle the legacy of cruelty that had haunted him for so long. His transformation was neither immediate nor complete, but every day was an earnest effort to prove that change was possible, even in the wake of unspeakable mistakes. Family gatherings, once fraught with tension and painful reminders of the past, now took on a different tone. In a small, sunlit park, the three of them would often sit together, sharing stories, laughing at old jokes, and even shedding tears over memories both painful and bittersweet. These moments were imbued with the promise of a shared future, one where every small victory was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The laughter that filled the air was not a denial of the past, but a celebration of the strength it had taken to overcome it. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the renewed family began to envision a future that was defined by hope rather than fear. New traditions were established: quiet Sunday picnics, annual trips to the countryside, and even small acts of collective service that brought them closer together. With every passing day, the promise of new beginnings grew stronger, a constant reminder that the future was theirs to shape, one moment at a time. The journey toward a fresh start was marked by challenges and setbacks, yet it was also filled with moments of profound joy and quiet triumph. In the gentle embrace of spring, the family learned that every ending carried within it the seeds of a new beginning, a promise that no matter how deep the scars, the heart always had the capacity to heal and to hope. Even as new beginnings took root and hope blossomed in unexpected places, the shadows of the past lingered in quiet corners of memory. For Sarah, Jake, and Mark, the journey toward healing was a constant negotiation between embracing the promise of tomorrow and contending with the ghosts of yesterday. Late at night, in moments of solitude, the painful memories would rise unbidden, echoes of a time when fear reigned supreme and love was obscured by cruelty. Sarah often found herself revisiting the events that had once defined her existence. In the stillness of the night, as she stared at the darkness outside her window, she recalled the sound of Mark's harsh words and the weight of every unspoken tear. Yet alongside the pain, there was also a quiet sense of triumph, a recognition that her survival, her ability to forge a new path, was in itself an act of courage. Each memory, painful as it was, served as a reminder of the strength it took to escape the cycle of abuse. She began to document her journey in a journal, a chronicle of the past, the present, and the hopeful glimmers of the future. Through her writing, Sarah sought not only to heal herself, but also to offer a beacon of hope to others who had suffered in silence. Jake, who had long borne the burden of witnessing his father's fury, struggled with moments of anger and bitterness. Every time he encountered a situation that echoed his painful past, the old wounds would reopen, threatening to overwhelm him with grief and rage. Yet in those moments, he also found the resolve to remember the progress he had made. Surrounded by supportive friends and mentors, Jake learned strategies to channel his anger into creative pursuits, music, art, and even activism aimed at supporting survivors of domestic violence. Each step was a reminder that while the shadows of the past could never be completely banished, they did not have to dictate the course of his future. For Mark, the shadows were perhaps the most persistent of all. In quiet moments of self-reflection, he was haunted by the faces of those he had hurt, Sarah's trembling vulnerability, Jake's determined defiance, and the stark realization that his legacy was one of pain. Despite his ongoing efforts to change, the weight of his past loomed large, a constant specter that reminded him of the irreversible damage he had done. In therapy sessions and solitary walks through the city at dusk, Mark confronted the harsh truth of his actions. Each step toward redemption was accompanied by the persistent echo of regret, a reminder that the path to forgiveness was as much about reckoning with the past as it was about embracing the future. Family therapy sessions became a space where these shadows were acknowledged rather than ignored. Together, they delved into the darker recesses of their shared history, discussing the events that had left indelible marks on their souls. While these sessions were painful and fraught with tears, they also allowed for a collective release, a shared understanding that the past, with all its darkness, could eventually give way to healing light. The act of speaking the unspeakable, of facing the memories head-on, became a cathartic ritual that gradually diminished the hold of those painful shadows. Though the past continued to haunt them in quiet moments, each day also brought new opportunities to build a future that was not defined solely by those memories. The family began to explore ways to transform their pain into purpose, volunteering, advocating for victims of domestic abuse, and speaking out about their experiences in a bid to help others. The lingering shadows served as both a reminder of what had been lost and a motivation to ensure that such tragedies would not be repeated. In that duality lay the paradox of their journey. The past could never be entirely erased, but it could be harnessed as a source of strength and compassion. In the quiet, early light of a new day, the family gathered in a modest community center that had become a symbol of their renewed hope. The building's faded walls, once marked by the struggles of many, now resonated with the promise of a fresh start. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, a collective, unspoken vow that despite the scars of the past, tomorrow held the promise of transformation and healing. Sarah, standing before a small audience of community members and fellow survivors, shared her story with a voice that trembled yet carried undeniable strength. Her words recounted the harrowing journey from despair to hope, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. In every syllable, she honored both the pain of her past and the promise of the future. Her narrative, filled with both sorrow and redemption, was not merely a recounting of events, but an invocation for change, a call to all who had suffered to believe that a better tomorrow was within reach. Jake, now emerging as a confident advocate for domestic abuse survivors, joined his mother on stage. Together, they recounted the transformation of their family, a story punctuated by heartbreak, defiance, and ultimately, the courageous act of forgiveness. Every eye in the room was fixed on them, witnessing a narrative that transcended personal tragedy to become a beacon of hope for others. In that moment, the scars that had once symbolized their suffering were reimagined as symbols of strength, a legacy forged not from fear, but from the unwavering promise of change. Mark, now a quiet figure in the background of this public journey, listened with a profound mixture of remorse and gratitude. His transformation had been long and arduous, marked by setbacks and moments of deep introspection. But as he watched the faces of those he had once harmed, now filled with understanding rather than hatred, he felt a glimmer of redemption. The promise of tomorrow, once so distant, now seemed attainable through relentless effort and the slow mending of broken bonds. As the gathering drew to a close and the community dispersed with renewed resolve, the family lingered together in the soft glow of the setting sun. In that quiet, shared moment, they embraced the understanding that while the scars of the past would forever be a part of them, the future was an open canvas, one that they could paint with love, compassion, and resilience. The promise of tomorrow was not an empty phrase. It was a tangible reality built on the lessons of yesterday and the hope for a better, kinder world. With each passing day, as they continued on their journey of healing, Sarah, Jake, and Mark held fast to that promise. A promise that no matter the shadows that lingered, the light of a new dawn was always within reach.